Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this sixth in the series, the Emergency Shelter Learning Series, Frequently Asked Questions for Low Barrier Shelters. We're really glad that you all joined us today, wherever you are calling in from. We have a very busy schedule today with a lot of questions to answer, so I'm going to dive right into this. Do just want to give a quick update, a quick overview of the logistics for the day in case this is the first time you're joining us on one of these webinars. Everybody's lines are on mute. We have about 300 folks on the call right now and anticipate having even a few more before it's all said and done. So if you have a question, there is a question box on your little panel there. You can see what your panel looks like, and if you go to the tab that's called questions, that's going to come directly to us, and we'll be happy to pass any of those along. We are going to try and get to some questions at the end today. This is really going to be entirely a question and answer session today, so if you have clarifying questions, please feel free to type them in. If we don't get to them today, we will get to them at a later time. So feel free to send them in. There's also a chat box at the bottom that you can ask some questions, but the question box is really the easiest for it to get to us. We will be sharing the slides, and this webinar is currently being recorded, so this will also all be shared with you. You will receive a link to the YouTube channel where the webinar is posted about a week or so after the session, and you can catch it there again, and you can feel free to pass along any of the slides and the recordings to your team and to anybody else in your community who may be able to benefit from it. So today we are going to be addressing some of the most frequently asked and the most challenging questions that you all pose to us. So over the series, which we've been doing for several months now, hopefully many of you have joined us on previous calls, you all have asked us a lot of great questions, both during the webinars as well as in emails afterwards and in survey responses that we've asked you to submit to us. And so we've pulled those together. We've combed through all of the questions, all of the comments, and pulled out some of the ones that really made us think that the hardest, the ones that popped up the most frequently, and so we're going to be asking them today. So we have several staff from the National Alliance to End Homelessness along with us today, who will be answering questions, as well as three fabulous experts from the field who are going to respond to these questions. So they'll all introduce themselves very shortly. But before we do that, just wanted to start off with a poll to get a sense of who's here today. So I'm going to add this poll is going to launch right now, and so hopefully you all are seeing the poll, and this is asking you what best identifies your role in the homeless service system. Are you an executive director, a program manager? That's the first one. Case manager, frontline staff at a shelter, a funder, a COC or system leader, or an outreach worker? Getting a great response so far. We have about 60% of you all who have voted. So I'm going to leave this open for just another minute. All right. So I'm going to close this, and let's take a look and see what the responses are. So hopefully you all can see this. So it looks like about 57% or 47% of you, sorry, are executive directors or program managers of a shelter. About 22% are frontline staff. 8% of you are funders. About 20% are COC or systems leaders, and we have a few 4% who are outreach workers. So thank you so much for that. We cut over to one more poll. So I'm going to ask you, which of the following best describes your shelter? Which of the following best describes your shelter? Are you amazing? You're the best at what we do in your community. Are you on a path towards improvement? Are you feeling like you're doing okay, but you could use a little bit of guidance? Are you struggling to really be able to operate a shelter that can end homelessness and serve those who are the hardest to serve? Or are you feeling totally lost and could really use some help? All of these are totally acceptable, and no matter where you're at, we're happy that you joined us today. About half of you have voted, so leave this open for another few seconds while some more votes are coming in. All right, about 5 more seconds. All right, I'm going to close this, and let's take a look at the results. So about 16% of you said we are amazing, we are the best at what we do, so that is great, and we look forward to hearing your insights today. Most of you here said, 42% said that you're on the path towards improvement, that you're making some changes and you're starting on this journey. So we are also glad that you're here today and hope we can give you some really concrete tools to make those next steps. About 27% said you're doing okay, but you could use some more guidance. So we're going to have plenty of guidance for you today. 12% said, we're really struggling and we could use some more help to make sure that we're really serving those who need it the most and doing it the best. And we have a few folks here, 4%, who say, help, we're feeling totally lost. So we're here for you as well. So hopefully you'll all hear, no matter where you're at, you'll hear some answers today to some questions that you all have and can think of some new ideas that you can take back to your community and implement. So I'm going to kick this over to Cynthia Nagendra, who is the director of the Alliance's Center for Capacity Building, who is going to just kind of briefly set up the webinar today. And so Cynthia, you want to take over?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ben. So good afternoon, everyone. I guess for some of you who might be on the West Coast, it might still be in the morning. So good afternoon, good morning. If you're returning, welcome back to the Alliance's Emergency Shelter Learning Series. If you are new, this is a great place to start, and we encourage you to go back and watch other webinars in the series. We're going to show you a link on where you can find those in our resources, or you can just Google Emergency Shelter Learning Series, and you will be able to find all of the webinars. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. We're really excited by how many people have been telling us they are listening into the learning series, and most importantly, making changes to get better outcomes for the people that you all are serving. And we're doing this series because we know that shelters are just incredibly important to ending homelessness and really need the support and guidance to be able to do that well. Shelters and other types of crisis housing, as you've probably heard me say many times before in this series, are critical to the functioning of an effective crisis response system, because people who have housing crises, and every community has people who have housing crises, need a safe and decent place to go immediately. All shelters in a community don't have to be low barrier, but every community needs enough low barrier shelter so that anyone who needs that place to go when they're in a crisis has a bed and a safe place to stay, especially if there are people who are living on the street or other places not meant for human habitation. If your community has a high unsheltered population, or really any unsheltered population, it may be because you don't have enough low barrier shelter. And if you have people who are staying for long periods of time in shelter, it might be because there isn't enough of a focus on getting people housed quickly. And so if your community is experiencing these challenges, this series is really meant to help you respond with solutions that can happen right inside shelters. We're also going to talk about how the system can support shelters to do this more effectively, because you can't do it on your own, but there is a lot you can do right inside your shelters. So just to let you know what the series has been and what it will look like in 2018, as I said, we know that operating an emergency shelter is incredibly important and incredibly challenging work in any community. And the series is really meant to help communities, shelters, system leaders, funders build on the very important and good work that shelters already do to respond to homelessness, and to shift practice in ways that will benefit people experiencing homelessness, as well as help communities to take a systems and housing-focused approach to providing emergency shelter services. Many of you are retooling your systems to be housing first, and shelters really need to be part of that conversation. And we want to acknowledge that making small and big changes to how you have always done things is not easy. It's very hard work. And we really just hope that you will hear about strategies and experiences from other shelters to make your work easier, better, more rewarding, and ultimately improve the outcomes for people experiencing homelessness in your community. We've heard from many of you that you are already seeing positive outcomes from the changes, which we are thrilled about, and we're learning so much from you. So thank you for sharing feedback. We welcome you to keep sharing that feedback, challenges that you're seeing, good and bad. And through the series and associated tools and guidance that we're posting, we hope to get you started and feel supported in making these changes to improve the lives of the people that you serve. We have a series of webinars the 5 key elements to operating effective shelter, self-assessments and action planning templates on our website that are both online and that you can also download so that you can have your shelters or your staff take these. They're very quick assessments to kind of see where you are. Tools that your shelter can use to improve programmatic policy and operational changes, guidance from other shelters, and all of this, again, is downloadable from our website. The primary goals of the series are to help communities strengthen shelter policies and services, implement a system-wide approach to ending homelessness that includes emergency shelter services, align shelter goals with the community's overall goals to end homelessness. They should really be lined up. And processes of how to get into shelter and how coordinated entry is connected to shelter and housing, all of those things need to sort of be thought of together and in a systemic way. And we want communities to provide, again, enough low barrier, safe, and housing-focused shelter so that you have folks who, the people have some place to go, as I said before. And we hope that this is not just informative, but also helps you act and helps you make the changes that you need to make. These are just some of the tools on our website. There's a shelter outcome metrics forum that can help you look at your data very differently than maybe you have before, with instructions on how to do that. Should be pretty easy because it should be data you're already collecting. If you want to know more about that and how to use that, please let us know. Shelter self-assessments, as I said before, infographics, and most importantly, coming soon, we're going to be posting sample RFPs. We have some videos featuring shelter providers who've made the shift to low barrier shelter, a motion graphic of the 5 keys to effective shelter. It's kind of a nice training tool for your community or your staff, and many more webinars coming up in 2018. This is a link to our Emergency Shelter Learning Series resources and webinars. These are the past webinars in this series that you can download from our YouTube channel or right from this link. So please go back and look at them. They don't have to be watched in order, but you can. It's certainly a helpful tool for you to watch with your staff. Throughout the series, we've been talking about how to retool shelters by aligning your shelter with these 5 key elements. The 5 key elements to effective emergency shelters are, again, I'm sure you've seen this before, but just as a refresher, having a housing-first approach, practicing safe and appropriate diversion, ensuring your shelter provides immediate and low-barrier access, making your shelter housing-focused with rapid exits to housing services, and using your data to measure your shelter's effectiveness and make shelter design decisions. Again, many of the webinars that we have done in the past address many of these keys. Here are just a few responses to our survey asking what has been the impact of implementing the keys to effective shelter that you have made so far on your program, your staff, the people you serve, and your community. We sent out a survey and got some great responses, and here are just a few. Here we have, as a partner at the county level, seeing the increased engagement and willingness from shelter leadership has made the biggest difference. We know that that is a key part of making these transitions, making sure that you have buy-in from your leadership at shelters. Another community responded, more people are able to access our shelter that are truly the most vulnerable in our community. While we still cannot serve everyone, lowering the barriers has been significant for many folks that have never had the opportunity to access shelter and be immersed in a supportive environment. That is fantastic to hear. Another community said, we're having safer shelter, faster moves to housing, and they said they have a 150-day drop in length of stay. Rules that were more friendly, yet maintained shelter management and engaged clients in discussions about shelter practices. So that's all really exciting to hear. We have a lot of responses like that, and we would love to hear more from what's happening on the ground.
And I would just add,
I'll take it back over to Ben. Oh, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I just put the link to the SurveyMonkey survey over there in the chat box. So feel free to check that out and answer that. So we're happy to have more responses, more and more. The more the merrier responses from you all to hear about how you're using these webinars so far and what will be helpful in future webinars. Because again, like I said today, a lot of what we have crafted and pulled together is from the very feedback that you sent us through those surveys and through these webinars. So it's really important to us, and we are taking a look at it. So please take some time to fill out that survey. It really should only take about 5 minutes or so of your time, so it's pretty brief. So I actually don't know if I introduced myself at the top of this webinar today. So my name is Ben Cattell-Knoll, and I'm a technical assistance specialist with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I'm going to be asking the questions today and posing them to our fabulous panelists whose names you see before you right now. So you just heard from Cynthia Nagendra, who's the director of the National Alliance to End Homelessness Center for Capacity Building. We also have my colleague Kay Mosier-McDivitt, who's a senior technical assistance specialist at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. So that's our NAEH team. Then we also have, as we mentioned at the top, 3 awesome providers from all across the country who are doing fabulous work in various capacities at shelters. So we have Chris Freed, who is the Chief Programs Officer with the Los Angeles Family Housing Shelter. We have John McDonald, the Vice President of Adult Services at Crossroads, Rhode Island. And we have Marianne Haley, who goes by Mimi, and she's the Deputy Director at the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness, who does some sort of high-level work in community planning across the state of Connecticut. So we are very happy to have Chris, John, and Mimi, as well as Cynthia and Kay on the call today. You'll be hearing lots more from them. So let's just dive straight in. So,
and I think, Ben, we wanted to give, we wanted to just give our panelists a little bit of a chance to talk to us about what their communities and shelters are like. Yeah, just to give folks an idea on what they do and where they're coming from.
Yeah, so let's go down the line. Can we start with Chris? Chris, you want to say hey and just talk a little bit about what you all do at LA Family Housing?
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, right. Perfect. So I am Chris Freed, and I work for LA Family Housing. We are the lead coordinated entry system for our service planning area in Los Angeles. And for those of you that don't are not from Los Angeles, I think it's been vocalized quite a bit about what we're dealing with here in LA. Our most recent count was right around 57,000. Our 2017 count was right around 57,000 people experiencing homelessness on any given night. So my role here is to oversee not only our shelter sites, of which we have 3, in addition to a couple of houses that we rent in communities for families, and several motels rooms that we have on any given night, but also the coordinated entry system itself, and anything related to programs. And so this is a new role for me. I've been with LA Family Housing my entire adult life, as I like to tell most people, but I've recently taken over our entire individual single adult population portfolio as well. And so I was pulling some stats just to be able to give like one little highlight. Last year, I hate this number, but just because I just don't like the number itself, but we housed 666 households last year, which was about a 35% increase from 2 years ago, when we were not operating low barrier housing first focused shelter. I'm done.
Thanks, Chris. So let's go down the line and go to John from Crossroads, Rhode Island. John, welcome, and tell us a little bit about what you all do.
Sure. We're nowhere near the scale in Rhode Island as to what Los Angeles is experiencing, but Crossroads runs 2 family shelters, a DV shelter. We have 2 women's shelters and 2 men's shelters. We serve well over 3,000 households a year, and our numbers are proportionate. We, in our rapid rehousing program in 2017, were able to house 135 individuals, 88 families, and additionally, we do specific work with sex offenders, and we were able to house 61 sex offenders in 2017. We do face challenges. We've been doing this for a few years and have been very successful and have seen increases in our positive outcomes, but funders still need a kick in the pants now and then to really look at evidence, to look at outcomes, but we're making progress. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, John. And finally, Mimi.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Mimi Haley. I'm with the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness, and we have an organization that works statewide. So we work with our 2 COCs and members across the state. We have 8 different regions in the state, and a lot of standardization and like a single type of coordinated access system that is also regionalized within those 8 regions. So we have a lot of, I think, experience in different types of ways of doing things. And we work with shelters across the state in developing best practices, implementing diversion. We do a lot of diversion training, trying to get shelters as connected as possible to our coordinated access system. And we have the vast majority of our shelters are part of that coordinated access system. So we have had a lot of success across the state, and we have also worked with the NEH to do some emergency shelter learning collaboratives, and that has been terrific. So I'm happy to share anything from that as well.
Thank you so much, Mimi. Appreciate that, and to all of you for being on the call today. So yeah, let's dive in. We got a lot of questions to get to, and so I don't want to prolong this any further. This is just some stuff from the last survey that we posted that you all responded to. What you said, your biggest challenges when it comes to providing low barrier shelter. So you're going to hear these themes come up a lot: staffing, looking at substance use, working with families, funding, criminal records. So these are all kind of themes that are going to keep popping up today. So let's just dive right into these. So the first question is about working with people who use substances. So, and these questions are all coming in verbatim, sort of more or less as you send them to us. So I'm just going to read through them and then ask some of y'all to jump in. So our shelter is located on a site where we provide services to families with young children. How do we keep people safe and allow low barrier access to people who are under the influence? We have had numerous problems where we've needed to call the police due to aggression when people are under the influence. This makes staff and guests feel unsafe. How do we manage these situations more effectively? Chris, can we start with you? How are you all handling this out at LA Family Housing?
Oh, sorry. So I keep muting myself and then trying to unmute myself and get my phone back to where it needs to be. So
no worries.
Yeah. So it's how do you keep people safe and allow low barrier access to people who are under the influence when you have young children on site? I think it's really a matter of a couple of key points. One is that it's really important to understand that in keeping people safe and in keeping kids safe in particular, it doesn't mean that we just completely allow all substances to be used on site without any type of potential consequence. But not everybody that uses use in the same way that necessarily necessitates a call to children and family services. And so it's a matter of assessing each individual person, each individual family member for really assessing them about what is their connection. Are they able to, if they're using, are they able, or are other families in the site using, are those people able to be around kids because their use is not affecting other people? Meaning, so if they're smoking marijuana, let's say, and they're smoking it outside, they're not using it in the facility, their kids are fed, their kids are clean, their kids are going to school. The same is true for a two-parent family. If you have one of the parents that potentially may be using meth, but is using meth off-site, not using in front of kids, not using in front of anybody else in the shelter, and kids are fed, kids are going to school, kids are happy, and the behavior is not coming in and affecting anybody else. So when they come in, they go to sleep, they do those types of things. So it's really about assessing each individual family to make sure, and each individual family member to make sure that they're not disrupting anybody else along the way. And if those things aren't happening, then we can work with those families and individuals and keep everybody safe.
Thanks so much, Chris. John, I wanted to kick this over to you as well and see if you had any thoughts from your experience in Rhode Island.
Well, I would agree with Chris that separating the behavior that happens within the confines of your facility from what is happening outside. And remember that we are working with individuals and families who come to us with, lots of issues, a host of issues. So, we work with lots of folks who have substance use problems, and, recognizing that what is happening outside, as long as it's not impacting what's happening inside, we need to, tease that out a little bit. Safety is important. We're fortunate to have off-site our family programs, but at our main location, we do have and serve families and individuals, and need to, be very mindful about safety with particularly the children. And we have lots of doors that lock and key cards to provide a level of monitoring and safety so that people can't easily move between programs.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to move to the next question, which is on the same theme and topic. So also about working with people who use substances. So one of the questions we often hear is, how can we meet the needs of different populations who need to access the shelter? For example, our residents who are trying to maintain sobriety are upset that they have to share space with people who are using, and they can get upset when there are not consequences given out for behavior associated with drug or alcohol usage. Aren't we threatening people's sobriety? So not sure, Chris, John, do either of you want to jump in on that one and talk about how you've helped manage the needs of folks who are trying to stay sober with folks who are actively using?
John, you want to go first on this one?
Sure. So I want to just say first and foremost that a shelter isn't a treatment program. That, reiterating what I said a moment ago, that we are serving people with substance use issues and providing opportunities and choices for everyone there. We can refer folks out into the community to get supports and services they might need to maintain this sobriety, but there is no expectation that everyone who comes through the doors is, going to abstain. And we need to make that, and we do make that clear to folks, that what we're providing is shelter in a quick path to housing as quick as possible, but not a treatment program.
And so I just want to jump in. So I actually just had, a couple of weeks ago, we had an incident on site during the early hours of the evening, and I just happened to be on site. And so we had a few of the residents that kind of got together and were kind of upset and came and said, we don't understand. We're trying to do the right thing here. We're trying to get our lives in order, and yet you have people that come in and out that are under the influence, and it's upsetting, and what are you going to do about it? I think there's a couple of different things. So and this is what I explained to them that night. I said, first, it's really critically important that there's open communication between participants in the program and staff. One, because we need to understand where people are at. And so if we have people that are currently in treatment and feel that their sobriety is being put at risk, then we can help them navigate, as John said, some of the other services that they need off-site. So that's one. Two, I said, here's who we're here to serve. And so I really had an open conversation with them around who it is that we're here to serve. So if I were not to allow substance abusers, if I were not to allow people that were experiencing severe mental health, if I were not to allow sex offenders, if I were not to allow, and I could go all the way down the list, who would we be serving? Would you guys all be here? And so they stepped back, and it actually resonated. And I said, what would your answer be if you were in my shoes? So it really is about open communication, having the conversations, making sure that you have the staff on site that can do the referrals off-site for people who need greater level of care. And it's also really important that in the room space itself, that we're trying to allow for people to have a safe place to sleep. Because people will use, but it doesn't mean that they have to use on site. And so it's really about making sure that we're paying attention and that we're doing our best to make sure that we're keeping substances off site so that people have a safe place to sleep at night. But in terms of where people are at in their lives, people are at very different points, and sobriety isn't a requirement.
Thank you so much, Chris. Mimi, Kay, Cynthia, anything any of you want to add?
I really don't think I have much more to add than that. I'm just going to echo everything you already said. I think that one thing I've heard from drug and alcohol counselors is that in working with people who are, trying to get sober, that the thing is really for them to work on their sobriety, by finding supports outside of shelter and strengthening sobriety in the ways that people work on their recovery, and that shelters really just can't do that kind of work, as John said and as Chris said. So I think that when you're the people who are trying to stay sober need to find those connections outside of shelter and not have to have all those resources inside shelter.
Yes, and I would just echo, this is Mimi, what everybody had said, and our experience also with some of our shelters that moved from higher barrier to low barrier and had some of these challenges have done so, with, continuing to kind of refine what they do, but with some great success. And these are some of our more resistant shelters to really lowering those barriers. And I think that once it happened, it seems a lot more scarier before they did it. So for those of you who are out there, we'd be happy to share some of the stories of some of our shelters that have made that shift and really did it successfully.
Thanks. I do want to ask a quick follow-up about this. I'm seeing a couple questions come in through our question box regarding safety. So just in terms of how you support folks who are in your shelter who may be using, I think we think about this a lot currently with all of the news of the opioid epidemic in the news. How are you all helping ensure that folks who may be using are able to stay safe, that we're reducing risks of overdose or making sure that participant safety is really highlighted in terms of serving folks who may be actively using?
I can jump in there.
Okay, go ahead,
John.
Chris. Go.
No, go, John. It's fine. Go.
Narcan training. Making that available, making sure that you have that available for staff 24/7 is probably the most important thing. And doing quick searches as people are coming through your door. We don't use metal detectors or anything like that, but having people open up their bags and things like that, just to make sure that you have a sense of what's coming in and can screen some of that out. But most importantly, training your staff and having Narcan available is huge.
So, and I just want to back that up. So every year I since the hashtag thing has become really like a thing, I've put a saying up on my wall. And so this year my saying is hashtag every room, every day. And so, and coming from a really trauma-informed place. So, yes to the Narcan. All of our staff that are shelter specific are trained on Narcan. It's critical and necessary. The second thing is that my staff are required every single day to go into every single unit and not do a search necessarily, but it's to go in and have conversation with people. How you doing? What's going on? Because you'll learn a lot when you go into their living space around how things really are within the environment in which they're living. So if you have someone saying, I'm terrible, my roommate was up using all night in the bathroom, well, then that gives us the ability to then have a conversation with the roommate. That doesn't mean that we're violating the harm reduction model. It means that we're acknowledging that we have someone who's actively using in a room with other people that maybe aren't, that it's affecting their ability to sleep and to feel safe, and that we need to have a conversation with this person about their behavior. So it gives us the ability to address what's going on and really use the harm reduction model so that we can start potentially working with people to get them to use, definitely not on site, but to do it off site, and hopefully we can start to have them see how their behaviors are affecting their own life, and then maybe making some shift.
I love that. Every room, every day. That's a awesome mantra. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next question, which we sort of started to touch on. John and Christy, I think you both mentioned this a little bit about who you serve. So looking at serving different populations of folks. So how can we allow families to be in the same building as registered sex offenders? Should we be asking about criminal backgrounds to avoid any danger or liability? John, I think you had just been talking about this a little bit. Do you want to talk a little bit, and then Chris will also ask you to chime in here about how you all do this in LA.
Sure. And this is an important issue. You know, we've both touched on, I think all three of us have touched on safety. Safety is important. Being mindful of children and families and folks who are coming through our doors is, paramount. We are fortunate that we do have off-site family programs, but at our main facility, we do have a family overflow room that does very often have a family there. And during the day, we can have, dozens, 150 different people coming in and out of the building. And we don't do background checks on those folks. Folks who go into our family programs are required to have background checks. At our main facility, we can't have sex offenders stay overnight because of our proximity to a school. We have a school across the street. But during the day, folks can come in, receive services. You just have to be mindful. As I mentioned earlier, we have, lots of doors with, key card access that provide a measure of safety so that folks can't easily move between programs, and really gives us the ability with that and cameras to try and keep folks within areas and not, wandering throughout the building.
I would kind of pretty much echo that. I don't know that I have 100% of the answer. I would say this, that we have a shelter for families and a shelter for individuals that's located like on the same piece of property. They're separated by gates. We have pretty good security and resident advocates 24 hours a day. So it's really about staffing up in the way that you need to staff up. In terms of the motel rooms, because I think that's where it becomes a little bit more tricky. We operate right now, so even on this night and with all the beds that we have within our own portfolio and with our partners in our region, we still have 150 families as of last night in motel rooms. It becomes incredibly challenging to ensure that all the people that are living in the motel, even individuals that we've placed into motels while we're moving them from motel to their permanent housing site, oftentimes we don't know if they're on the same site. So we're educating families, having conversations with them, how to look and to pay attention when they're in settings like motels, to be very, very observant of their surroundings. And I just think that that's just good practice anyway. But I'll go with what John said because I don't know that I necessarily have the perfect answer for that one.
Thanks. I wonder, Mimi, could you speak briefly to kind of the higher level perspective on this, sort of from a systems perspective, how you all view, making sure that folks, even if they are registered sex offenders, or have a criminal background, how to make sure that they have access to shelter somewhere in your system?
Yeah, as a state, we have different regions, so it depends on, somewhat on the shelters, but on the state level, some of the work that we're doing is really looking at how people get put onto the sex offender registry. Our sex offender registry is very, very long, and we are doing some advocacy work to really be able to have it be risk-based rather than having it be offense-based. So I think that that's an important element because some of the people that are registered sex offenders, might not actually be much of a risk. And so on the statewide level, that's something that we've been looking at. And we've also done work with our probation officers and Department of Corrections to improve reentry practices so that we are really starting that process earlier before people are released into the community. And they have been very receptive to this. It's been an ongoing thing for a few years now, and we now have a joint task force to help figure this out. sex offenders are, the toughest, I would say, to find housing, but also like thinking about like developing a rapid rehousing program is, one of the things that we're hoping that our criminal justice system might look at, some reallocating some of their transitional housing to some rapid rehousing programs potentially for sex offenders, which would allow more spaces and it would be less expensive. So, some things like that just on the statewide level, we've been doing some work on. And then in terms of shelters, just really trying to be, there are shelters that cannot, accept sex offenders, some of the family shelters and some other places where it is a challenge. So, those shelters that can, the probation officers and, some of the other folks are aware of. We do have some shelters that do criminal background checks, although, that is often, looked at as a barrier for entry. So we don't have all the answers yet, but we're working on it constantly, and this is definitely one of the most challenging areas for us as a state.
Can I just add something, Ben? Sorry, I just thought of something.
Please.
So just in terms of, so we don't do criminal background checks on families or individuals at LA Family Housing, and we often do we will look on Megan's Law though, just for the sex offenders, not because we don't want to serve them, but just to make sure that we are protecting the families. But in terms of a criminal background, so I missed that, and I just want to really kind of speak to that. I would say that if we were to not serve people with criminal backgrounds, that our shelter would be empty. And that would probably be very similar for our family shelters too, because a lot of our families are experiencing some form of criminal background, even if it's something just like a petty theft. So we intentionally don't do that because one, criminal background checks take a long time, and we don't want to leave people outside. And two, it would eliminate almost our entire population, and that's also because LA has spent a tremendous amount of time with reentry and making sure that reentry, as people exit jail facilities, we actually have coordinated entry located in our jails, and this is our coordinated entry packets, so that the jails know when they're releasing somebody that potentially could be homeless, and making sure that they're connected to the right coordinated entry lead to get them into at least interim housing while they're trying to get them permanently placed.
Chris, this is Cynthia. I want to ask you a follow-up question. So you don't do any criminal background checks, and you run family facilities. Have you seen, and I think that you have transitioned from maybe at one point having required that, and now you no longer require that, I think. Have you seen a change in incidents or any sort of uptick in, criminal activity because you're no longer doing background checks, or have you not seen an impact?
I would say that I haven't seen any uptick in anything other than the fact that right now we're working with some of the most challenging people on the individual side. And with that, just, I'd say around criminal background, no uptick whatsoever. It's made no impact. That definitely has not made the impact.
John, is that similar in at Crossroads? Oh, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Oh, it was actually Mimi. I just wanted to say that that's consistent with what we do as well, is that we advocate not to have a criminal background check. So, and the vast majority of our shelters do not do criminal background checks.
So it's only the family shelters that do criminal background checks. We don't do them in any of our individual programs, and we also have moved away from the use of security guards, and we have not seen an increase in the number of incidents or the severity of incidents in any of our programs. We do have some flexibility in terms of who we allow in our family programs, but at this point we still do conduct checks.
Thanks so much, everybody. So this is obviously a hot topic, and have a lot of follow-up questions coming in. But in the interest of time, and just trying to touch on a lot of different topics. I'm going to move on to the next one, which I think, Mimi, you started to hint at this in your response, and this is definitely a hot topic that comes up a lot here. So, we recognize that one of the keys to shelter is helping decrease the length of time people are experiencing homelessness, and so we want to make sure that folks are not in shelter for very long. So the question we have then comes up to time limits. So should we have time limits at shelter? How can we ensure a quick flow through our beds without a time limit? So somebody shared with us that they removed their 90-day policy, but now have noticed many long stayers. So, and if we should have time limits, what's an ideal length? Cynthia, I'm going to start with you on this one, and can you just share a little bit about your perspective on this?
Sure. Having arbitrary time limits, 30, 60, 90, 120 days, whatever it may be, is not recommended. We don't recommend that you have arbitrary time limits. And that is for the reason that I do understand that some funders have put time limits on their shelters. And again, usually those are arbitrary. And I think that the idea is that it will help people exit. But what we see in most shelters that have time limits is that they are still exiting back into homelessness, a significant percentage of the people who are timing out. So what we recommend instead is, and I think this is what we've seen in working well in shelters, is that to get people to sort of flow through shelter quickly and to not sort of get stuck in shelter, to flow through to housing, the shelter has to put a very core emphasis on housing. This is something we talk about in housing-focused services in one of our 5 keys, but the message the shelters have to give, and this is a message sometimes shelters have to change because they haven't been giving this message, is that shelter is a part of a process to get housed quickly. Shelter is not a final destination. Shelter is here to help you try to resolve your housing crisis. We're going to help you get housed. We're going to help you find housing, remove some of those barriers that you have to get into housing. But really, the whole goal here is to get into housing or return to a house situation that makes sense for you. And that might be moving in with family or friends, but at least we're talking about housing. All of the signage in your shelter, all of the policies, procedures, your mission statement, anything sort of on the walls of your shelter should reflect this focus on housing. Putting housing kind of at the core of all of the conversations staff have with clients makes a big difference. And what we see is once shelters start to put this focus on housing, their long stayers start to, their average length of stay starts to get shorter, not because they're being exited arbitrarily for timing out, but because they're getting housed. So while we want you to shorten your length of stay because we want people to be homeless for a shorter period of time, what we want is for those people not to return to homelessness, but to get housed or to go to some kind of permanent housing situation. So if you are having long stayers, I would recommend that you sit down with your staff and with your clients and look at who those long stayers are and try to figure out why they've been there for a long time and what are the barriers they're having to get out. Is it because they are good at staying in shelter and a lot of shelter staff feel like, okay, well, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, they're kind of staying compliant, they can stay? Is it because they don't have an exit strategy? Or there just simply isn't, they're waiting on benefits, or they might even have income but don't have that security deposit, something they could get through rapid rehousing. What is it? Are they on a list that they're waiting for that they're never going to get off of? So focusing on those long stayers, focusing on getting them housed in a permanent solution will help lower your average length of stay. So I think that probably, Chris, John, maybe you have some thoughts on this too.
Sure. When we first shifted over, we had some women in our shelter who were very much at home in that shelter. They had pictures on the walls and everything else. And it is a challenge. It's a constant challenge to look at those folks who have been around for a period of time to help and recognize that it's the staff. As staff, we are responsible for holding ourselves accountable. That's where the accountability needs to rest. So taking those successes and really capitalizing on them, having conversations with folks, as you said, problem solving with individuals, really helping individuals to see that they can have that sense of community, because some have really established a strong sense of community in that shelter, but helping to replicate that once they move into housing. It's really hard. It's something we're still learning and getting better at. It is very difficult, but really capitalizing on your successes and problem solving with folks.
So, and I'm just going to, because for time's sake, I'm just going to add just two very quick points. One, I love what John just said about accountability, because it starts with staff. And so it's about culture and shifting culture. Shifting culture is really, really hard because it starts with staff. Staff often point the finger at the participant, but it really is about our motivation and our response and how we're addressing things. And if we're doing a really great job, then that will resonate, because we're listening to what the clients or the participants' desires are in terms of what housing is, and such. The second point, so culture. The second point is, one of the ways that you can help shift culture is by shifting the staffing around and everything that you have in terms of staffing. So instead of case managers, which is a really popular name for people doing casework, maybe make a housing navigator. So at LA Family Housing, we've changed every title that we have here that has housing in it in some form or another. So for the people that are working in shelter, for the people that are helping people find housing, even if they're not living in shelter, and for the stabilization on the back end, it's all about housing navigation, housing location, housing stabilization, and those things help to even facilitate some of the change within culture and send the message to the participants that we're working with that we are not here to fix every other problem. Our focus is really around housing. And then we can start to work on the other issues once you're there.
Yeah, this is Mimi. I just wanted to add, I think using those metrics that the NEH provides, and to really focus on some of those metrics, has been very, very helpful to our shelters in terms of, time limits, which we, don't encourage, but really knowing and having all of the staff know where you are in terms of, long-term stayers and what your average length of stay is really, really helpful. The other thing would be just programs within the shelters that are only available for people that are living in shelter, to make those be available to them outside of the shelter, I think is a really helpful thing to remember, because to encourage them to go out into the community and to also have the same things available to them is really important.
And so you're going to have one more person jump in on this. I just don't think this conversation to me is one of the most important ones in really shifting. I think sometimes, people get focused on, the low barrier, the limits of time, and not this housing piece. And I think Cynthia often says that all of the components, to make this work, you really need to look at all of the key elements of shelter. They all work together. I can't reiterate enough what Chris just said, so I want to hear that, is that when you start languaging everything with this permanent housing focus, something starts happening. And so the transition is really hard. It takes a while for that to happen, but as you become a housing focused shelter and new folks come in, the newly homeless folks are coming in, and there's that flow that is happening. It starts picking up. The transition is much harder when people come in and you've said you have a 90-day limit, and then people learn that that's been lifted. And then, yes, you do have sort of those log stairs that have sort of nested in, as John has said, put pictures up on the wall. When you switch to the housing focus and new folks come in, and you're not saying this is a 90-day shelter or this is a 60-day shelter, one of the things we've learned from a lot of providers is that people often, if you said this is a 90-day shelter, people weren't doing much about their housing plan until like the week before that 90 days was up. And then often people were being exited without having moving to housing. And so if you from the front door start changing your language and not talking about time limits, but saying our goal is to get you out of here right away. We want to get you rehoused as quickly as possible. We're going to need you to work on that. And calling from day one, not a case management plan or a service plan or all those other names we talk about, but it's a housing plan, and everything is housing focused. And, languaging that, our goal would be that everybody can, get back into housing and get out of shelter in the shortest amount of time possible. And we'd like to see it to be in, 2 to 3 weeks. It's just changing those languages can help. And so I think that we get worried about those time limits, and when people first hear that, and they haven't worked on their housing plan because they've had 90 days and, now they hear there's no limits, it just sort of becomes that, well, I could stay here and not worry about it. Changing that language matters. So I just wanted to add one more thing about the housing piece, because I think you'll find that doing that's going to make a huge difference.
Thanks, Kay. And that actually is an awesome transition to our next question. Before we move on to that, though, real quick, I do just want to pose a question. I think this one's for Cynthia. So we had a couple questions coming in about, folks saying, we'd love to have, remove our time limits, but our funders require that we have, X number of day time limit. And so it can impact their funding and their ability to run the shelter. Just wondering if you have any thoughts about that, and sort of how to work with funders who may be requiring lengths of stay.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I've worked in a lot of communities where this is an issue, and frankly, we've just had to educate the funders. So if your funders need as much education on all of the transition, the culture change that Chris referred to, I think is also important to include your funders into, to help them understand why you're taking away time limits and what you're replacing that with. That you're showing that, time limits aren't actually getting you the housing outcomes you want, and that what you're seeing in other communities is that this focus on housing we've just been talking about for the last few minutes is really what gets people to exit. So I think talking to your funders, often I have, when we've talked to funders or helped empower communities or organizations to talk to their funders, to explain why it's not that you're trying to keep people forever, but it's really about getting better outcomes, getting more, really using your dollars better, because you're hopefully serving more people, exiting more people to housing that aren't going to come back, right? So the arbitrary policy isn't helping to house people, and it's just sort of lengthening the time people are homeless. So I think really helping people understand those data points and helping funders understand that this is not getting them the outcomes that they want through their dollars. So I would really recommend sort of educating them, and then show them your data too, and find, I'm sure that the providers on the call will share their data too, to say, look, we don't have time limits necessarily, and these are the kinds of outcomes we get, even in some very difficult to house communities or working with very challenging folks.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. I think that really helps clarify that. So to move on to the next question, which Kay really set up for us nicely. So certainly we need to have a back end way to move folks out of shelter into permanent housing. But then that does raise a challenging question, which is the pushback of, our community does not have affordable housing. We don't have enough permanent supportive housing vouchers. We don't have enough rapid rehousing. Folks who have high barriers, don't have landlords that will take them. One person shared that their prioritization list has hundreds of people with very high acuity scores that are waiting for a voucher that they are unlikely to receive anytime soon. How can a shelter support those folks? I think maybe Chris, can we start with you on this one? I feel like Los Angeles is maybe one of the most critical examples of a community like this that just has a need that far outpaces the resources. So how are you all handling this out there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and so people might not like my response. So I'll just tee it up that way. I think one of the things that I've learned over the years is you have to use the resources that you have in hand, right? And so for Los Angeles right now, because we recognize, and when I mean we, I'm talking about me and every other person who lives in Los Angeles, recognize that homelessness is on the rise here, and it's gotten to a level where leadership has finally stepped in and said, we have to do something. We can't just pretend that this isn't occurring. And so we got Measure H passed, which Triple H, which is building, has $1.5 billion for 10,000 units permanent supportive housing over the next 10 years. and then Measure H, which was to provide the services. So about $350 million a year dedicated just to homelessness and homelessness-related services to transition people out. A significant portion of that in Los Angeles, because we know building housing takes time. So even though we have that money, the first project isn't really set to open that's using those dollars until later on this year. So we're looking at the services side. So if we look at the services side, the majority of the money that we have is for rapid rehousing. We know that we have a lot of people that have super high acuity, and that probably would be prioritized for permanent supportive housing. But we're never going to have enough. And so we have to be better about understanding that we don't know how well people are going to do in housing until we see them in housing, except for, of course, the select few that we know there's just no way. But we've been proven wrong so many times where we've seen people with super high acuity, and we thought for sure they needed permanent supportive housing, but because we didn't have anywhere else to put them, we had a landlord that was willing to work with us and work with us around the rental agreement and move this family or individual in. And lo and behold, their acuity started to drop over time and their life started to improve, and they no longer would have qualified for the permanent supportive housing in terms of acuity score. And so my response to this is that every community has to use the resources they have at hand to be able to address the problems that they have, first and foremost, because that's what you have. And so for Los Angeles right now, we have an awful lot of rapid rehousing dollars, and we've learned that people cannot necessarily dictate who, or cannot necessarily identify who will and who will not do really well in housing. So my response to that is right now, I'm not going to let them sit in shelter for 3 and 4 and 5 years waiting for a potential voucher that may never come, or because the next person that we identified on the street has a higher acuity than them, and so they just keep getting passed up. We're going to attempt whatever we can and understand that even while people are receiving rapid rehousing, that they don't maintain their homeless status. But if they were, they do. But as HUD would say, that's not how they phrase it, right? So if they were eligible at point of intake and they're still receiving financial assistance, then if you've identified that this is not a method that's working for them, then you can shift them into a higher needs model. And so I know that I'm challenged on this a lot, but I do believe that we just can't sit and wait for year after year after year for people to be potentially matched to a resource that may never come, and that the shelter bed then becomes their permanent residence. That's not what shelter was meant to do. It actually hurts them. It doesn't help them. Permanent housing helps. So there you have it.
Thank you so much, Chris. Appreciate that. So let's jet set to the other side of the country. John, how's this going in Rhode Island? How are you all handling these challenges?
Well, oddly, Rhode Island has, according to, our experience every day, but a national report called Out of Reach about rents, Rhode Island, particularly Providence, has one of the highest rental costs in the country. So we don't have enough rental assistance. We have really high rents, and we have very little permanent supportive housing. So echoing everything Chris said, and briefly, that yes, you have to be creative. You just can't allow folks, and we have experienced some folks with high acuity who once in housing, their acuity has dropped. Others we've had to rehouse a number of times, and it's a learning process, and it's a process of, improving your case management services and learning from your mistakes that, okay, something else, some other intervention needs to be tried. But there isn't a community in the country that has enough of anything. But, we've done some experimenting with, doubling up, having folks share an apartment, and that's something that we're going to look into a little bit more. We've had some successes and some splendid failures, but it is something that makes it affordable, that 2 folks on limited income can make it work.
Can I just say one thing before? So us too in LA, so shared housing is the undertaking of this country. And so shared housing, the concept of it isn't new, but us really targeting around that will help to because our costs, like John's, I think we're 3rd or 4th in the country with the highest rents. So I think the most recent number was somewhere around a 2-bedroom would cost $26.65 an hour. I actually really think that's closer to $30 an hour. So even at the best point, it puts most of the people that we work with out of reach. And so shared housing is a huge venture in LA. But letting people sit, I just want to reiterate this, letting people sit around in shelter forever is not good.
And I hate to follow up. This is Kay. I hate to follow up after such awesome stuff from both Chris and John. I have to say, I'm sitting here nodding my head as I hear them talk. But I also want to say that, when I was in the field, we were housing people that looked like this out of shelter long before there was rapid rehousing and long before there was hardly any permanent supportive housing. We used our creative resources. We used any provider we could think of, any faith-based person we could think of, any resource to find dollars and monies to do this. So just, I think sometimes we've created these things to help make the system flow better, but I think we have to remember that shelters from day one have always had people move to permanent housing without rapid rehousing and without permanent supportive housing. And once those models were there, we started sort of feeling like, and especially, when we're using coordinated entry and then people are, being put into a track for a certain thing, we start sort of saying, well, until we get that, we're just going to keep people in shelter. Just remember, you guys have always been creative. The shelters and staff have always been really good at doing this. And, let's use that and get back to that creativeness again, which both Chris and John clearly are showing they've done that. Good job, guys.
Thanks, Kay. So just want to go on, shift gears just very slightly to another question about finding housing, which I want to pose to Mimi. So Mimi, what we're hearing on the provider side, sort of the challenges of when there's not enough resources on the back end, and the ways that folks are being creative and doing the best with what they have. But, we do get these questions about, so how can we help our system scale up housing resources? How can we right-size the interventions so that we can get more, so that we can help more people or help them in the ways we really do want to help them in? So just wondering if you could speak to this question a little bit about, aren't our shelters only as effective as the permanent housing options in our community? How can we get our communities to support the idea of permanent housing and interventions?
Yeah, so it has been an effort in Connecticut, and we continue to advocate for more housing resources, but I think John had said it, we will never have enough. And so in, a world of limited resources, what do you do? And I think that, I really liked what Chris had to say is, you have to find some solutions, and it's not okay to just be all right with people languishing in shelters for long periods of time. So being resourceful and reaching out to funders, and I think Kay had mentioned this, is something that we do as an agency, but we also encourage everybody to do, is to look, everywhere for these housing resources. So that might be looking at your turnover rates for PSH. That might be looking at alternative funding sources for rapid rehousing, looking at reallocating. We did a lot of reallocation from transitional housing to rapid rehousing, working with COCs, working to educate funders and educate boards, but also educating those community partners in, what the system should look like, and, that there needs to be these housing resources. And, I'm sure all of you do that in some different ways, but it really is about trying to turn over every stone to find those housing resources. And the shared housing, I think we really are, I think poised to be integrating that more intentionally into our system as, one of the first options that we're going to be using. We're doing training actually this week with Ian DeYoung in shared housing across the state, and really looking at how do we integrate that. And then also, just, I think a lot of things already got talked about, but in the answering of this question, in the last question, but the shelter diversion, and really bringing that up to scale, because if you don't have a robust system of shelter diversion, then you're going to be, dealing with a lot more people on wait lists and coming into shelter that might have been able to be diverted. And we have one area that is able to divert 80% of the families that are coming in for shelter that night, and other regions that have really increased their rates of diversion dramatically over just the last 2 years. So that is another sort of option that I think has been enormously helpful. And then, we have a close working relationship with our Department of Housing, and I think that has been instrumental for us, and they have been great partners in our state. So if there's opportunities to, do some, increased collaboration around how resources get allocated by really looking at the data. We're very data driven, and understanding like where, resources need to go and where, you're really falling short as a system, and looking at, reallocating some things and advocating for that on a systems level is something else that I think is very important.
Thanks so much, Mimi. So we are, so this webinar could certainly be about 5-6 hours. We could be here all day. You all are just sharing some incredible wisdom with us, and so much stuff that we all can learn from and take from. But I'm mindful of our time that we've asked folks to be here for, and looks like we have about 15 more minutes. So I'm going to move into like sort of a lightning round of questions. So I'm going to pose a couple more. These have been kind of bigger systems level questions, more ideology kinds of questions. I'm going to pose a few more really specific kind of how-to questions. And I'll just pose these to one of you at a time, and we'll just kind of go through them a little bit more quickly. So get a lot of questions about how do we serve folks with really high needs, particularly folks who may have really serious medical needs. We've had a couple questions come in about folks who are very elderly. Let's start with you, Chris. How are you all in LA working with folks with really high needs who are in your shelters?
So we've had this question come up a lot, right? Which is, wow, we've seen like such a spike in the needs of the population that we've served since we've prioritized who's getting the beds, and so we went back to our funders and said, we want to be able to serve the people that have the greatest need, not the people that are most compliant. We'd love the most compliant ones, by the way, but that's not really who needs us. So we went back to our funders and said, these are the positions that we're going to be able, that we need in order to be able to effectively manage the shelter environment. And so we brought in a much more robust clinical team just to be able to mitigate from a preventative lens instead of a reactive lens potential meltdowns, and that includes around seniors, that includes around mental health and substance use. And so we, while the majority of the team that works within the shelter themselves are resident advocates, our housing navigation, because it comes from the coordinated system, they come on site, but they're not located on site. We went to the funding stream and said, we need this in order to have a place that's safe. And that we don't, it's not complete mayhem. And so our funders said, fine. And so they did. They funded. We have two full-time MSWs that are on site, and we have a licensed clinical social worker that provides support to them. And we're constantly evaluating and stepping back, saying, do we need more? Is this sufficient for 250 single adults living together in a very small, confined space? Even though they have rooms, there's 6 or 8 of them in a room. And so is it enough? And so we're constantly willing to look at ourselves and to gauge if we need more supports and more services and bring them on site. We also have through our outreach teams a nurse, and so we can bring, even though the nurses are around the outreach teams, we can bring them indoors to work, because all the people that are in the beds are people that were found outdoors. And so the outreach teams are already familiar with them, including the nurse and the doctors that work with those teams, and so they can come on site and provide service.
Thanks so much. John, anything quick to add from your experience in Rhode Island serving folks with really high needs?
Real quick, I'll say pushback. there's one of the directors here who had some real success in putting people back in a cab or calling an ambulance and sending that individual back to the hospital and filing complaints with the Department of Health. That had some real impact, and the hospitals recognizing they have to take more responsibility. So that's my 1 2-sentence response.
Thanks, John. So I'm going to go to the next question here, and John, I'm going to pose this one to you. So sometimes folks are saying in our community, you know, we're really relying on volunteers rather than professional staff to provide a lot of services. So how do we balance that low barrier approach with folks who may have limited professional resources or expertise when we're trying to serve the hardest to serve folks? Uh-oh. So, John, do you all work with non-professional staff ever?
Sorry, I was on mute there.
No worries.
We do not here. We have some volunteers, but in past organizations we have. The most important thing is helping people, educating people. That this has come up earlier in the webinar, to educate everyone who's involved with your organization around what are the outcomes, what does the evidence say, because people want to make a difference. That's what you have to focus on with your volunteers is wanting them to have a good experience, but most importantly, wanting good outcomes.
Thanks. Mimi, any thoughts from your work in Connecticut on this?
Yes, we did do a lot of work on this, and we have had some shelters that are very lightly staffed and have volunteers, and we had one shelter that there was really only a couple of people that worked there. So we have been faced with this, and I think that, you know, training is always important, but also just, you know, I think taking away some of the fears of what it means to move to low barrier and to understand the importance in the system was very helpful. Also working with the community as a whole, where that shelter is, so that the board understands and that there is, you know, a community support around that movement towards more low barrier was really helpful. And the other thing is just the large number of rules sometimes can take a lot more effort to enforce, and there can be more conflict because of rules. And I think that that's something to consider as well, that trying to enforce a large number of rules can be difficult, and that moving to fewer rules can sometimes actually be much, much easier for volunteers. And it's not always, you know, change is hard though, and so it's also like, you know, introducing that and being supportive and having, you know, supports in place as those barriers are lowered and the rules are taken away.
Ben, can I just say one thing? Sorry, because I know it's lightning round. So I would caution that if you're using volunteers to be in shelters, and I understand that not every community has enough funding to adequately staff shelters, but you wouldn't. I'll take a quote from my good friend and my part-time boss, Ian, and say that you wouldn't want a car mechanic performing open heart surgery on you. The people that we're working with have lots of tough issues. We need to be able to provide the right support, and unfortunately, volunteers aren't always equipped, and you cannot train them in a day or a week or 6 months, oftentimes, to be equipped. So I would say that wherever possible, switch the volunteers from that component of like actually providing direct service to interns if you don't have money. So social work interns, even just BSW interns, somebody that has actual experience in the field as much as possible, and use the volunteers for some of the lighter touch type things, only because we really are, if we're working with the right group of people, they have a lot of challenges and a lot of needs, and needs that volunteers can't always meet. Sometimes it could do more harm.
Thanks so much, Chris. So, Chris, I'm going to pose this question to you as well. So we've heard this, and this actually come through in the chat box a little bit today as well. So, we talk about being housing focused, and our program should be housing focused. But what if our clients are not focused on housing? How do we? So this question that came in, this is just one of the ways it's been asked, but it's been asked in lots of different ways. How do you encourage clients to focus on housing and getting out of shelter? Some of our clients do not want to develop a housing plan. What do we do if the client does not want to work on getting housing? Should we exit them if they're not showing progress? How do you promote accountability to goals? So just wondering how you help motivate clients to work towards housing.
Was that for me?
Yeah, go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
Oh, so I would say that if you're having difficulty in getting clients to want housing, then maybe you're not, maybe potentially you're not listening to what they want, because a housing plan, oftentimes we found that staff will go in, and even my own staff, I've heard them where they've gone in and said, this is we're looking for a studio apartment, 1-bedroom apartment, shared housing, whatever the deal may be, and this is for you. And so the people resist. And so I'm going to give you a story that just happened a couple weeks ago, where I was walking from my office down the street, and I ran into a participant, and the participant said to me, look, I don't want to do this rapid rehousing thing. I don't think it's for me. I have a kid that comes to visit me on weekends. And so I said, what do you mean you don't want to do this rapid rehousing thing because you have your kid that comes and visits you on the weekend? Can you explain that a little bit further? And he said, I don't want to do a shared housing thing where, like, my caseworker offered me the shared housing where there's 2 people in a room, and that's just not going to work for me and my kids, so I don't want to do the rapid rehousing thing. And I said, well, that's really interesting. First of all, that isn't what rapid rehousing is at all. And second of all, then I need to talk to your caseworker, because we don't do shared housing where there's 2 people in a room, right? Shared housing is like 3-bedroom apartment, 3 people, 2-bedroom apartment, 2 people, 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom apartment, 2 very, very small families, mom and kid. So I'm trying to get through this really quickly. I think it's really, really important that we listen, that we hear what their needs are, and that we try to find them housing accordingly. And also, it's okay to bring people back to reality, that if they want to live in your highest, the most expensive community within the region, that you have to be, that, you don't just pretend like that's going to happen. So it's okay to bring people back to reality, but it's really, really important that you're listening to what they want, and then you're creating a plan around what they want, because it creates buy-in. It's their plan. Therefore, it's no longer the agency plan. It's a participant plan. Period.
Thanks so much, Chris. That is an awesome answer. So I'm going to skip over a few of these just for the sake of time. Mimi, I think I'm going to pose this one. This one we already started to answer. I'm going to skip that one and move to this question. So we want to move to a low barrier model, but our board does not want this change. For example, there's been a longstanding warrant check at intake that we wish to discard. However, the board believes the policy offers safety and protects us from liability. How do we handle this? How do you get your board on board?
I will say that. Oh, go ahead, Chris. Well, we had Ian come in and do a presentation to our board right at the beginning when we started this process, and walked folks through the evidence, the outcomes, and having another voice, a voice outside of Rhode Island, someone who has had experience with communities all over the United States, Canada, really added a level of credibility and helped the board get off the dime and move forward with a housing first model and a low barrier model.
Hi, this is
Awesome.
Mimi. So we went through this with some of our shelters through the Emergency Shelter Learning Collaboratives that we did, and the staff were on board and the executive directors were on board, but the board was very, very resistant, and the other community members. And I think mostly out of, I think that their main reason was they were trying to be protective of staff. And they were afraid that this would, really endanger people to remove some of the barriers. And so it was a long conversation. It was very, very heated. We were yelled at quite a bit, actually, in the beginning. And we, I think, started to move some of the board members and the community members. But what really, at the end of the day, did it was one of the staff members who had, been through training around, best practices in emergency shelters, advocated for the change and said, I think we'll be okay. And to really kind of take away that fear element for the board, I think was the tipping point. So for what that's worth, that really worked very well in that instance.
Thanks so much. And I'm going to piggyback off of that on another sort of buy-in question. And you sort of started to hint at this, Mimi. Chris, I'm wondering if you can handle this one. So this one says, I'm a funder. Many of our shelters don't want to make these changes. How do we get the buy-in of shelter staff and leadership and support them to make this transition? Can you talk a little bit about, as you've made changes within LA Family Housing, how's the staff responded?
So, the saying goes that when you do culture change, oftentimes you lose the people that had all the bad culture, and being okay with that. So I wouldn't say I've lost everybody. I'm not trying to put out there, fire your entire team. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm going to go back to 2011, the first time we brought a truly dynamic speaker in who started saying, you're not serving the highest population like you think you are. And as the wheels started to shift, and where we've come to today, I would say that we really do have a significantly new team, from then to now. I think that it starts from the top, and so the top has to believe what's being said and then convey it with everything that you've done. And so I mentioned this earlier, so I'll just repeat it again. It's going back, it's looking at your staffing model, your organizational chart, changing the way that you term new staff. It's about filling positions that are needed based on gap, not just on a new contract coming in. And so that you have all these different caseworkers when that's not really what you need. Because when you start to get staff the things that they need to be able to do their job effectively, people's culture changes and people start to buy in. And when they buy in, then it's very easy to turn the population that you're serving within your environment because they see that everybody else is on board. So I really believe it starts at the top. It's about reorganizing yourself. It's about filling your gaps and providing the things that your staff need to do their job well. And oftentimes, unfortunately, just to reiterate this piece, it means that you will lose staff, but you cannot keep staff who don't believe in what you're trying to do, because all it takes is a couple to that are completely against it to influence everybody else. And so if you're really trying to create change, then you have to be really firm on what that change is and be able to provide the support for people to change.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on this one too. This is Cynthia. I wanted to say that one of the ways, and I mean, I echo everything that Chris just said, of course, and that one of the ways that when we are working with communities, we recommend they go about doing this is if you're a funder and you, or you're a provider, either way, the one critical way to change what people are doing in shelter is absolutely you want to get their buy-in and have providers give input, but also you have to change the funding. So if you have an RFP'd out for shelters in many years or in a long time, and your RFP really doesn't reflect any of these kinds of changes, that is something that probably really needs to change in your contracts and in your RFP process. So it's not that you suddenly spring this on providers and say, okay, tomorrow we're going to ask you to be low barrier and housing focused and everything that's in the 5 keys, but rather let's get some buy-in on what things need to change and what outcomes we're going to be looking for in 6 months or the next funding cycle. Give providers some time to give input, but also time to transition. So you might, in Connecticut, they gave their shelters TA support to really help staff that, this change is coming. We're going to be moving to a housing first, housing focused, low barrier model. We're going to give you some technical assistance support to make that transition, but it's coming, and we're going to be looking at outcomes like exits to housing and length of stay and returns to homelessness. Those are very different than the outcomes we may have been looking for before, like how many bed nights you've had or how many people you've served. Instead, we want to focus on really encouraging you to house people and not necessarily dinging people as soon as, they're you don't want to encourage people to serve kind of, you want to encourage people to serve the most vulnerable. So you want to give them some time to transition to that and give them that support. But the funding, the contracts, the RFP process, that really needs to reflect these changes and include provider input, of course, but that really needs to happen across that system for the changes to really happen.
Thanks, Cynthia. So we are bumping up to 3:30. There's still, of course, so many more great questions here to answer. I'm gonna throw a little wrench into things here. I want to go back through each of you all one more time, and I just want to hear from you. We didn't prep you all for this in advance, but if you could, give us your 1-minute speech. If you could make one big change in your shelter, what's the biggest sort of aha moment you've had in the past year being a shelter provider, or if you could just wave a magic wand and make one change that you think would make the biggest difference in shelter, what would it be? And let's start with Chris, then we'll go to John, and then Mimi. So Chris, if you have a magic shelter wand, what do you do? What do you change?
So I think I already said that. Every hashtag, every room, every day, it's staff going in and communicating with people that are participants. It's understanding who they are, what their needs are, what's happening, so that we can stay on top of issues before they become issues. It's preventative versus reactive. And so, and that helps when you're trying to operate a low barrier model and make it successful. And it's because you already know what to expect because people are telling you and you're paying attention and you're communicating. So I really I believe in that. That is my mantra this year, and it's about just really great communication with the people that we serve. And I just want to in 2 seconds repeat, just say ditto to everything Cynthia said. I answered it from a provider versus from a funder perspective, which is tie goals to money, and things change.
Thanks so much.
I would say
John.
Training. That I would love to be able to provide more training, that you can never provide enough training, to go back, to offer new higher level curriculum, but also to reinforce the basics, that to give staff the opportunity to increase their skills, to feel more confident in what they're doing, so that they can be, and the clients can be more successful.
Thanks, John. Mimi?
Yeah, I would just echo both of those things. We tend to do training, like introduce the concept, do a lot of training, and then tie that to, funding and, that kind of progression, so that it's not all of a sudden, you need to do this and you don't even know what it is. So we want to kind of introduce the concept and then tie that to funding. And then, really looking to performance-based contracts. And I think making sure that training is available to everybody, because that is something that is difficult to train everybody to be able to afford it. And it's a great investment. So if we can offer webinars, and we have a ton of training materials on our website, to be able to really bring that to as many people as possible. And I just would also emphasize the value of cross-training with, coordinated entry staff, shelter staff, so rapid rehousing staff, so people feel part of the system. It's not just a program-based training, I think has been very helpful as well.
Thanks so much. So it is 3:34. We're just a few minutes over time, which isn't too bad. So I'm just going to wrap it up here with just a little bit of what's next for us. So we are hoping that this is the first of sort of a new or a continuing series in the shelter learning series. So we will be having more webinars. We anticipate having another one in March. As soon as we have the date and the topic, we will send that out to you all. We are likely right now we're looking at looking at data and evaluating shelters' performance with data, which meshes really well with what several of you just said in terms of your sort of magic wand moment and tying performance to and outcomes to funding. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that and just sort of how you measure and what you should measure in order to know if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing in shelter. So look for that announcement coming out here shortly. And as always, we would love to hear your feedback in the chat box. Again, I just refer you back there. We do have the SurveyMonkey link there. Please feel free to fill that out. It should only take you 5 or 10 minutes, and we'd love to hear your feedback through there. But we're also happy to answer any questions. Email us, thecenter@naeh.org, and we will be more than happy to respond to your questions, your inquiries, your ideas for future webinars. So please feel free to send those in there. Mimi, John, Chris, thank you so much for your participation in this today. It has certainly given us at the Alliance a lot to think about, and I hope everybody listening in as well. So thank you so much for your time, and thanks to everybody who listened in and asked questions today. We greatly appreciate you, and we hope to see you in March.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.